you hear the word Jester, you probably think of the medieval period, the time of kings and queens. But the truth is that jesters existed in many other time periods, such as ancient China, Egypt, and Rome. Though despite the varying locations jesters derived from, their purpose remained the same: to entertain. Even if jesters had a number of duties, their main one always boiled down to making sure those in social and political settings didn't become too serious by poking fun at themselves or others. Overall, this is what the role of a jester would have been many years ago. But the jester I'm about to introduce you to is one that's much different than what we are used to. As for where the jester came from, my research and findings led me to an old European rural village called Autumngard. Upon visiting this dilapidated village, anyone would be able to tell that it had been abandoned for centuries, as there weren't any signs of life remaining, and scavengers had long since picked the small village clean of any resources. And yet, despite that, one could still piece together that life was once apparent there. Now, to get into specifics, this jester is more like a parasite than anything. To get an idea, think of a leech and how it latches onto a human and drains it of as much blood as it can. The jester does something similar, but instead of attaching to a human's physical body, it'll latch onto that person's psyche and slowly sap them of their sanity. And unlike most parasites we are familiar with, this one does not have a physical form that exists in reality. It will only appear to its victim, since it has infiltrated their minds. And something else that sets the jester apart from other parasites is that it is literally one of a kind, and it only affects a single human at a time. And the current human it happens to be infecting at this moment is a man named Charlie Mitchell, who's residing in a psychiatric facility many miles away from Autumngard. In fact, Mr. Mitchell was never aware of the village's existence. I came to discover this after tracking down and interviewing victims of the jester until it led me all the way to Europe and to Mr. Mitchell. Not all of them were cooperative, as most would expect, but I was able to gather enough information to create a visual on what the jester looks like to the ones who have been unfortunately infected with it. So first, let me explain what the brain of one afflicted by the jester looks like, and I'll do that by showing you what a normal brain looks like versus what a brain infected with the jester parasite looks like. As you can see, they look the same, but that's only because none of us are infected. But if you were to see what an infected victim sees, it would look something like this. As you can see, it looks like a long black tendril that stretches and crawls over many areas of the brain, but this is just the second stage of infection. There are 5 in total, so the infection can get much worse than this. Here's stage 1, the very start of the infection. The jester hasn't really taken over much of the brain as of yet. And stage 2, which we previously saw. Here, daily life becomes slightly difficult for the infected. Stage 3 can be a turning point for most, because at this point, victims tend to seek out help to rid themselves of this odd affliction. Then stage 4, not quite the point of no return, but they will be teetering on the edge of it if this were to progress any more than it already has. And finally, stage 5. At this point, there is no longer a chance to return back to a normal life, as the jester has successfully taken over each and every part of the brain, and no amount of medicine or any other type of treatment will help. In cases like these, which have only been documented once, that one being Mr. Mitchell, the infected have no choice but to be admitted to a psychiatric institute, as they can no longer care for themselves. But let's move on to the physical appearance of the jester, as seen through the eyes of an infected. What they described was something straight out of a nightmare, and could be one of the reasons why those infected with the jester lose their minds. The jester presents itself as tall and lanky with black charred skin. Its stomach has a literal knot in it, leaving no room for organs to be held, making its appearance all the more unsettling. It wears typical jester clothes, but these clothing look to be burnt and covered in dirt. Adding on to that, Its ruffled collar squeezes its neck rather tightly, practically choking it. As for its face, it looks like the skin on it was ripped off and crudely sewn back on. It has a wide, never-ending smile on its mouth with deep cuts starting from the corners of its mouth and ending at its ears, along with its eyes that too have cuts going from its eyelids up its forehead and down its cheeks. It's important to note that the Jester would never appear directly in front of them when they're awake and alert. They've only spotted this parasite in the corner of their eyes, in dark rooms while trying to sleep, and they only catch glimpses even in nightmares. And considering these traits and how the Jester is a parasite that only appears to the one it is currently infecting, I concluded that the inside of it was hollow and sheltered one giant tendril, similar to the one I described before, that's found in the brains of its victims. And though I do believe that the Jester may have once been human, there is no longer anything human remaining inside of it. The Jester's main goal here is to entertain. It wants to put on a good, compelling show, and so it continues to go further with its methods, which is why stages of this infection exist. Overall, the extent of what the Jester parasite can do to a human varies, so I'll go over the symptoms now. Stage 1. At this stage, the Jester has just infected someone and latched onto the brain. They will begin to experience dizziness, forgetfulness, and have random bouts of sleepiness. And during naps or when they fall asleep, the afflicted have reported that their dreams always seem to be normal until they notice that there was a tall, dark figure always peeking from behind objects or standing in their peripheral vision. And any time they'd look for more than a second or two, the figure would disappear. The infected would simply chalk it up as symptoms of stress, not getting enough sleep, or just having odd dreams. Stage 2. During Stage 2, the hallucinations will start. They will begin to see violent scenes that aren't happening in reality. Of course, this could send anyone spiraling, constantly seeing violent visions while others aren't able to see them. Not to mention the figure they reported seeing in their dreams and at the corners of their eyes seemed to be getting closer to them while still mostly hiding itself. And as their mental health begins to deteriorate, this could push them over the edge into the next stage. Stage 3. This is the stage most of the afflicted have reached before they finally begin to seek proper help, some earlier than others, but it tends to reach this stage before they think anything is wrong. At Stage 3, the afflicted will no longer be able to focus on simple daily duties. They will not be able to tell reality from dreams, and will begin to act out of character and become more violent, mainly towards things that no one else could see. Many I've interviewed have mentioned how their friends and family commented on how much they've changed for the worse over the span of a few weeks. But this violent exchange is because their hallucinations have begun to materialize and were able to hurt them. Victims have told me of how they ran into ongoing traffic due to being chased by monsters and crazy people swinging weapons at them, or how they've accidentally hurt loved ones trying to defend themselves from hallucinations that were able to touch them. Those infected have old scars and wounds from being hurt or scratched while these hallucinations happened. But just like the hallucinations, they were the only ones able to see these scars. Stage 4. During Stage 4, the issues begin to escalate. The afflicted experiences a loss of self, no longer behaving as they usually do, and are often in a state of fear or terror. They have frequent sensory overloads, causing them to have meltdowns in public, followed by extreme paranoia of being watched and followed, no real sense of reality, and their violence towards things that no one besides themselves can see increases. The entire world around them seems to change, and they've told me that they found themselves in dark forests, abandoned hospitals with no way out, and even buried 6 feet underground in coffins. They were all hallucinations, but also very real. Stage 5. The final stage. At Stage 5, the afflicted can no longer return to reality and is in a constant state of hallucinations. So whatever the Jester wants them to see, they're going to see it forever, up until they can no longer take it anymore. And even then, they can't stop it. Their sense of time is skewed, and they are no longer the person you once knew and loved. As stated before, this is the point of no return, and if you're at the 5th stage of the infection, there's nothing you can do. Charlie Mitchell is currently at this stage of the infection, and as of now, I can only assume that he wishes his suffering could somehow end. Despite how terrible being infected with the Jester parasite is, there is a way to cure and rid yourself of its torment for good. First, it's important to note that the Jester targets those with already weakened mental health states. There aren't many people who are aware of its existence. In fact, no one but those who have been infected with it really know about it. But it's better to be safe than sorry. Now surely, you'd think the best bet is to take medicine, go to therapy, and just live a great life, correct? Well, you'd be wrong. The type of help the infected must seek out is that of self-help groups, and that's because if they can find another person in a worse state than they're in, they can pass it on with a simple touch. Most people don't know this, and neither did I up until I interviewed the last person who was infected with the Jester parasite. Her name was Hannah Lewis. She told me that when nothing was working, medicine, therapy, and just getting enough rest, she thought it would help to find other like-minded individuals who were going through similar things. So, she sought out a self-help group and met with them one night. She mentioned that some were better off and others were worse. Not that it was a big deal to her at the time. She just wanted someone to share her burdens with and to hear the burdens and struggles of others. But what she didn't realize was that she shared more than just a burden. She passed on the parasite to someone else, a man who happened to be Charlie Mitchell. Charlie, a European-born citizen, was living in the United States at the time with his then-girlfriend. They had met, fallen in love, and he moved away from his country to be with her, but had fallen into a deep depression for reasons I am not aware of. He had troubling thoughts and tendencies, and so his therapist had suggested a self-help group, among other things, and it happened to be the same one that Hannah had begun to attend. Hannah stated that Charlie wasn't very talkative at first, but slowly opened up towards the end of the session since he mentioned that it would be his very last one before he flew back home to Europe. She mentioned that he chalked his condition up to homesickness, though she never asked for intricate details and just listened to the story he was telling. Though once the session was over, most people said their goodbyes and left, including Charlie and Hannah, both who shared a small exchange before parting ways for good. Hannah told him, "I hope returning home heals you, Charlie," and lightly patted his shoulder in a comforting way, and that was the end of their interaction. But that was all it took for the parasite to be passed on. A simple touch. After that exchange ended, Hannah noted that on her drive home, she felt different. And when she woke up the next morning, it was as if she was a brand new person. Or better yet, she felt like her old self. She wasn't sure how she got better all of a sudden, but she didn't bother dwelling on it. At the time, she was in stage 2, and was probably headed towards stage 3 before Charlie had come along. But Hannah, just like all of the other people I interviewed, was unaware that they had passed on this terrible parasite to an unsuspecting stranger, and I did not have the heart to tell them that they transferred their fate onto another. And so, that secret will stay with me, and with all of you. I was unable to interview Mr. Mitchell, as you all might have suspected, as he is in the final stage of the Jester parasite infection, and there is no way to pass on this affliction anymore. Being in a psychiatric institute, Mr. Mitchell has no doubt come across others and even touched others suffering from various other illnesses, and yet he remains the same. This outcome is not what anyone would have wanted, but this begs the question, will the Jester parasite die with him, or will it simply jump to the next person when he has passed on? Let us hope it's the former. 12th century Europe, the small village of Ottomgard was one that was rather far off from many major cities, and most people did not even know of its existence. And to be fair, this village hadn't been placed on any maps during that time, so it was safe to say that anyone who stumbled upon it was rather surprised. It was a village of no more than 300 people with very few services and amenities. There was a butcher shop, a smithy, a bakery, a church, a school, and a town hall, along with 2 or 3 other shops that helped the citizens get through their day. This village was run by the lord of the manor, a man who ruled over the village fiercely, yet he was kind to the villagers he'd come to know over the years. The villagers thought that while he was not perfect, he was indeed a good ruler and decision-maker. The village was a peaceful one, and besides a handful of troublemakers here and there, everyone lived in harmony. And a reason for that harmony was due to the council meetings that were held on a weekly basis to make sure the village was kept in order. During one specific council meeting, the lord of the manor received a suggestion from an aide of his to bring in a court jester, as things occasionally became too serious during meetings, and they could all benefit from a bit of laughter. And while the lord of the manor thought a court jester was more than unnecessary, he figured that no harm could be done and agreed to bring one in. That next week, the one appointed to be the court jester arrived. It was a rather interesting sight to see, considering he arrived fully dressed up, although there was no council meeting that day. But no one thought anything of it, as they had seen jesters before, so this wasn't an unusual thing. The man was given lodging and initial funds before the start of his actual job, and that was that. The village now had its new court jester, so the council had to see how he would perform. Soon enough, the day of the council meeting had arrived, and the members slowly began to file in before the meeting began. And the jester, as his job entails, strutted into the town hall with his head held high as if he were royalty, and cleared his throat before announcing himself as the newly appointed court jester in a haughty tone, casting glances at the already seated council members as if he were looking down on them. The men let out a few laughs and shook their heads, thinking the jester was absolutely ridiculous to make such an entrance, but it was a decent first impression. As the remaining council members filed inside and the meeting began, the jester occasionally cracked jokes at himself and at others. They weren't too frequent or too sparse, so most would say he was doing a pretty decent job. And just as quickly as it began, the meeting ended, and the members filed out of the town hall. The lord of the manor was the last to leave, and he gave the jester a good look before telling him that the next meeting is next week on the same day and so on, before leaving himself. It was clear he had not yet gained the lord's favor, something he aimed to change. A few weeks had passed since that first meeting, and the jester was slowly becoming more and more comfortable with his position and jokes as he got to know each member of the council better. And at the same time, the council began to enjoy having him around. He even began to get the lord's approval. It seems bringing in a court jester was a decent idea after all, the lord said, loud enough for the jester to hear, as he was walking out of the town hall once the meeting was over. Validation. It was something all entertainers craved for, and he wanted more. Why should he limit his talents to the confines of the council meetings? Should he not entertain the ones beyond these walls as well? Of course, he knew he would have to change up his tactics a bit, but he knew how to entertain a crowd as well. And he was sure the council members wouldn't mind if he used his skills elsewhere, right? And so, in 2 days' time, the jester had come up with a little show for the village, and as expected, it went rather well. The villagers loved him and thought he was very entertaining. Perhaps he could do this more. At least, that's what he thought until the next council meeting arrived. One of the members in particular was not very happy with him. He told the jester that his talents were to be used for the council and the council only, not to bother the villagers. But the lord quickly came to the jester's defense, and explained that as long as he was on time for the council meetings, it didn't matter if he entertained the villagers a bit, especially if they seemed to enjoy his presence and shows. And with that comment, the members' complaints were squashed, and the jester, happy to have the lord on his side, thought to play a small prank on the council member who voiced said complaints. Was it a way to get back at him? Perhaps, but he'd never say so. And so, As the meeting continued, the Jester skipped around the room a bit, tossing a joke here and there when the time permitted and easing up the tension as well. While doing so, he hopped his way over to the unhappy council member, took a seat beside him, and gave him a pouting look as if asking for approval, which only caused the man to grunt out of annoyance. "Ah, do not be upset, sir. Even if you wish to keep me all to yourself, I simply must share my talents with the villagers," the Jester said, getting laughter from all but the already upset council member, who was growing angry and went to retort, but the Jester had already gotten up and was making his way to the other side of the room. The council member grunted in annoyance, but kept his comments to himself, blissfully unaware of the item that had been taken from him, the key to his home. "Ah, what a funny little prank this will be," the Jester thought in anticipation. Soon enough, the meeting once again came to an end, as they all do, and the members filed out one after the other. And soon after, so did the Jester. But on the way out, the Lord asked him, "Jester, why do I never see you out of uniform? It is as if you're always performing," he asked him, and the Jester smiled, saying, "Because I am. I simply love to entertain." The councilman stared at him for a moment before saying, "That's quite all right, but remember where your duties lie," then headed out. The Jester, curious as to why he said such a thing, simply shrugged before heading off towards his home, being sure to keep his eyes on the specific council member he was in the process of pranking. It seemed he didn't live too far from the man, and so he waited until nightfall. Where's that damn key at? It was the council member. He'd finally realized what he was missing, and it was slowly getting pitch black outside, save for a few lanterns here and there. He had lanterns around his own home, and if he were able to get inside right now, he would have come back out to light them, but that didn't seem to be an option at the moment. The Jester wasn't too far away, as he laughed silently to himself and watched the council member look around on the ground and dig in his pockets and search for his key that he'd never find. Though eventually, the Jester figured the man had fumbled around enough and slowly began to approach him. And right when he was a few feet away, he spoke. "Hello there, councilman. Are you perhaps looking for this?" the Jester asked, holding up the key with a grin on his lips. The councilman spun around with a gasp and clutched his chest, fearing the worst. But he quickly gained his bearings when he saw what looked to be his key in the Jester's hand, almost shocked that he had it. Though it was dark, a few lanterns from his neighbors' homes had enough light to illuminate the Jester. What are you doing with my property, you thief?" the councilman exclaimed, clenching his fist as he heard the Jester let out a laugh and watched as he tossed the key between his hands like a ball. "Whatever do you mean, Mr. Councilman? It's nothing but a little prank," he told the man with a smile on his lips. The councilman quickly grew impatient and stomped forward, snatching his key from the Jester's hand, who showed no resistance at all. "I will be letting the Lord know of your thievery, you damned Jester," the councilman said as he unlocked his door and hurried inside, slamming it shut behind him. Meanwhile, the Jester stared at his door for a few moments, truly wondering why his prank was not well received. He'd returned the key back after all, did he not? But with darkness closing in on even the brightest lanterns around him, he turned and walked back towards his own home without another word. Surely things would be fine. The Lord would understand. It was simply a prank. Once the day of the next meeting arrived, it was business as usual. The council members arrived, and so did the Jester, prepared to get the crowd going with his typical jokes and jabs. But things started a bit differently this time. "I heard you stole one of our members' keys last week, Jester," the Lord said, after sitting and quieting down the chatter. He had his gaze fixed on the man who looked as if he were about to prance around before the accusation was spat his way. "Stole? No, my lord. You've got it all wrong. You see, Quiet! The Lord told the Jester in an authoritative voice. "I brought you here to ease the tension in the council meetings, not to play petty tricks, pranks, and especially not to steal," he said, glaring at the Jester, In my village, we do not tolerate thieves, as I'm sure you know. And so, you will be receiving your punishment immediately." And once the Lord said this and waved his hand, the two men who were usually standing guard behind him began to rush towards the Jester with axes in hand. Wait, it was but a joke. Nothing but a simple little prank. I returned the key, I did. That night, I swear, the Jester said in a panic, starting to lose his composure as he was pushed down to the ground and held there. "No, please forgive me. It was but a joke. A joke." He continued trying to plead as he struggled with the guard who was forcing him to extend his arm across the wooden floor. Once he and his arm were properly pinned down with knees and heels keeping him in place, one of the guards raised his axe high and brought it down on the Jester's wrist, cleanly severing his hand from his body. And the council, being unfortunately used to the excruciating screams of thieves and other rule breakers, sat in silence as the Jester exhausted all of the air out of his lungs before ultimately passing out from shock. "Alright, lock him up in a cell in the basement for a week and cauterize that wound," the Lord told his men with a sigh before clearing his throat and properly starting the meeting, not even casting a glance as the bleeding Jester was dragged away. When the Jester awoke, he was laying down in a cell within a dark hallway that was illuminated by a single torch on the wall to his left, and within his cell was a plate with a single piece of bread on it, stale, no doubt. With a groan, the Jester sat up, but hissed in pain before falling back on his side. The origin of his pain was coming from his left hand. Seeing nothing but a charred, handless nub there in place of his hand made the Jester feel sick to his stomach. And soon enough, the little food remaining in it was on the cold stone floor. My hand, the Jester whispered to himself in disbelief at the sight. He hadn't even gotten a chance to explain himself. But what need was there? It was a prank, a joke. He was going to return the key. There was no need to treat him as a thief. As multiple thoughts ran through his mind, he heard a door open and quickly looked towards the source of light that had come from the hallway to the left. The sound of footsteps grew louder until his visitor reared around the corner. It was the Lord. "In 6 days' time, you will reach the extent of your punishment before being released to continue your duties. And I will say, although you are a Jester and your job is to play the role of a fool, you will not stoop to petty thievery in exchange for laughs. But I'm sure you know this by now," he finished, glaring down at the Jester, who said nothing and responded with a simple nod. And that was that. The Lord left, and the Jester slumped against the wall, waiting for his sentencing to reach its end. And its end it reached. The Jester was released in a week's time and was able to return back to his home, where he stayed until the day of the next council meeting arrived. As he made his way to the town hall, the villagers were very obviously keeping their distance from him. He'd been branded a thief, and within this small village, there was probably no way to clear his name. Before he entered the town hall, he practiced smiling, laughing, and telling a few jokes. It was a lot harder to play the role of a fool now, but no matter. He opened the door and pranced inside, appearing as if nothing had happened, although clearly, as everyone in the room knew, thanks to his missing hand and a red stain on the wooden floor that was poorly scrubbed clean, something did happen. Either way, the Jester cheerfully greeted the council members as he spun around and made his way off to the side where he typically stood. He didn't get much attention initially, but it was to be expected. Soon enough, the Lord entered and started the meeting as usual. These meetings typically lasted for 2 or so hours, and the Jester was to keep the air light during the entire time. What a bore! I think that. Lord, might I add that we introduce this instead? The Jester was suddenly cut off, and by the councilman he unfortunately played a harmless prank on at that. The councilman seemed to be doing that quite a bit, but the Jester did not want to mess with that man any longer. And yet, it continued to happen. Whenever he was in the middle of making a joke, or about to speak, or while he was making an utter fool of himself, he was interrupted by that same councilman. But again, he said nothing of it. He did not wish to lose his remaining hand. And so, when the meeting came to an end, the Jester tried to use what little of his remaining enthusiasm he could to get a laugh from the councilmen as they made their way out, mostly getting ignored though. And once the town hall was empty, he let out a long, heavy sigh and slowly exited himself, only to be ambushed by the same disruptive councilman he so wished to avoid. It seems after losing your hand, you've lost your skill as well, Jester. I've never seen such a pathetic act, the councilman said with a bellowing laugh, placing a hand on his stomach as he leaned back. But perhaps this ought to teach you a well-deserved lesson, yes? He asked the Jester in a smug tone. The Jester folded his arms a bit to hide his missing hand and did his best to smile. Agreed. Not only do I act foolish, but now I look foolish. The Jester joked along sheepishly, not wanting to antagonize him any further. That's right, fool, the councilman said before leaning in closer. And unless you want to lose another hand or your feet, you'd better not humiliate me ever again, he whispered to the Jester before leaning back, giving him a grin, and walking away. The Jester, clearly shaken by the threat, kept his eyes on the ground as the councilman walked away. The sounds of the world around him were replaced by the sound of his own heartbeat beating loudly in his ears. Had he really disrespected the man so much? Yes, he may have taken his key, but it was harmless after all. He even returned it. What could he have possibly done to receive such a negative reaction from the councilman? Maybe it was the joke about keeping him off to himself he had told the previous week before he was punished. But things like that are typical of Jester, so what could it be? Some other third thing he could not recall in previous weeks? A mere rumor that wasn't true? How could he have possibly offended this man to the point of being threatened when he merely just... The Jester was pulled from his jumbled thoughts by the sound of a scream coming from behind him, and he quickly came to and looked around to see a woman staring at him in disbelief. He knew his hand was gone, but surely it wasn't that terrible of a sight, no? As the Jester turned back around and looked down at where his left hand used to be, he was shocked by the sight of blood splatters. But he felt no pain, so where was his blood coming from? And he was right to be suspicious, since the blood wasn't coming from him, but from the body below him. It was the councilman. Upon seeing the sight of the councilman, who had blood still gushing from a gash on his neck, the Jester fell back in terror and scooted away from the bloody scene in bewilderment. How did this happen? As the question entered his mind, he eventually felt his remaining hand clenching around something hard. So he looked down and saw that he had been holding a sharp rock that now had blood covered in it. Shocked at the thought of even doing something like this, he looked around to see more villagers noticing what was going on, and in a panic, he quickly got up and went to run, but was grabbed and brought to the ground by some of the villagers. Wait! This isn't what it looks like! I couldn't have done this! He yelled out while struggling underneath the villager who was pinning him down, as the chatter and voices became louder and louder, only adding to his growing panic. Why had he done such a thing, and how? He had no recollection of stabbing the councilman, or even of grabbing the rock that was still held tightly in his fist. He couldn't have done something like this. Certainly not. He was just a jester here to entertain, so how could he have... Of course, with the crime happening in broad daylight, and with more than 10 witnesses, it didn't take long for the Jester's punishment to be given to him. He was to be burned at the stake. The Jester, having no clue how he could have done this, tried his best to defend himself, but it was no use. The villagers had seen him stab the councilman despite his argument of having no memory of doing such a thing. Defending himself was futile. He held an expression of bewilderment and confusion on his face all the way up to the day and time of his punishment. On an early morning, he was tied to the stake and watched as the wood was placed beneath him, feeling the fear quickly creeping back into his body. And he began to struggle against his restraints and yell out for help, hoping someone, a single villager he had made smile, would help him out. But no one responded to his pleas, as they were mostly drowned out by the heckling crowd, who threw things at him and shouted profanities. Useless. It was useless. And once the fire was set ablaze, it didn't take long for the flames to reach him. But before said flames left him unable to think of anything else besides the pain, he looked out among the crowd once more, and at the faces of the villagers he once shared laughs with. Many were yelling in anger, some were staring in anticipation, and a few more were hiding their faces, yet peeking through their fingers as if this was something they weren't sure they wanted to witness or not. But soon enough, the flames began to burn through his skin and bone, and his screams were finally able to reach the ears of the villagers. And before his death, one final thought crossed his mind. Is this the type of entertainment they desired all along? After the Jester was burned for his crimes, the burned stake, wood, and what was left of the burnt body was taken into the woods and tossed into a ravine by a few villagers. Afterwards, business as usual went on for everyone in the village. After holding a funeral for the councilman, the council meetings continued without a Jester, and the villagers went on their merry ways, paying no mind to the spot they used to frequent where the Jester did his shows. He was no longer of any importance to anyone, save for some of the children who really enjoyed his presence. Some may find it odd that the Jester had killed the councilman, but others might have rationalized it by saying that he had still been traumatized by getting his hand cut off, and so when presented with a threat, his body went into fight or flight mode without him being fully aware. But either way, he was gone, so no one tried to speculate and figure out why he'd done what he did. Shortly after that, one of the villagers that had disposed of the Jester's body went to the village doctor, complaining of seeing odd figures in his dreams and visions of things that weren't there, among other symptoms that aligned with the Jester parasite. After testing the villager to try and diagnose what the issue was, he had come up with the most plausible reason for these dreams and hallucinations at the time. He'd been cursed by a witch. No one knew if that was true or not, but what followed after this diagnosis was complete chaos. Women began to get falsely accused and burned at the stake for being caught doing anything even slightly suspicious. Only the ones who had the parasite at the time were safe from prosecution. But were any of these women really witches? Probably not. But the burnings continued happening as the parasite began to get passed from person to person. And as more women continued to get accused, the village eventually fell into ruin and was unable to recover. Now, was that man truly cursed by a witch? Who's to say? But I'd like to think that it's definitely a fact that those villagers angered someone or something. The Jester, being somewhat of a well-known figure in history, but also being a parasite who drives his victims crazy to the point of death, would be mainly classified under the unknown category. It is unknown how the Jester even came to be a parasite, but perhaps with more research, I'll be able to uncover the truth.